Why is HT actively opposed to the Turkish government, to the Turkish establishment, despite the fact that relatively Turkey is more democratic than other Middle Eastern governments? And that's because the real grievance for members of Hizb-ut-Tahrir and other Islamists, pre-Hizb-ut-Tahrir and post, the real grievance is the absence of God's law on earth. What they call ruling by the Sharia. That's the real grievance. And that's why Hizb-ut-Tahrir is actively involved in attempting to infiltrate the Turkish military to overthrow the Turkish regime in a military coup. They don't care whether there's a democracy or a dictatorship. Their rhetoric in the West, people that I trained who now go into the media and speak about this, they talk about dictatorships in the Middle East to appeal to liberal-minded people in the West. But they are also actively opposed to the relatively democratic Turkish regime. They are actively opposed to democracy in any Muslim country, and they have a booklet called Demokratiya Nizam al-Kufr, which means democracy is a system of apostasy. That book is published by Hizb-ut-Tahrir. So it demonstrates to you that the grievance isn't dictatorship, because even democracy is a grievance for them. So the real grievance is the absence of God's law. The meta-narrative is used to recalibrate the mind through which to interpret the grievance in accordance to the Islamist ideology. And in this case, then, it also leads to discovering new grievances where they may not even exist. Because once you say the real grievance is the absence of God's law, even if you have a relatively economically stable country with relative low levels of poverty, high levels of education, if it's not ruling by the Sharia law, that's still a problem for you. So you will discover grievances even if they don't exist, which is how Hizb-ut-Tahrir's tactic is in certain Gulf countries where they operate, where there are relatively less poverty, and people are relatively not so opposed to the political regimes because they're just generally apolitical, and they enter through a religious discussion. They say, well, actually, you're obliged through Islam to rule by God's law, and therefore you must work against this government.